I'm really excited to be able to host Laura today. Laura is an assistant professor in the eBio department at CU Boulder. Broadly, Laura's research looks at how ecosystems are affected by global change and the consequences for human well-being. Her work isn't limited to any particular ecosystem, and she uses tools from a variety of disciplines such as theoretical ecology, econometrics, decision theory to produce synthesis science in interdisciplinary teams. This aims to help better adapt and manage ecosystems in the face of global change. I've had the privilege of working with Laura since last July, and I'm really excited for her to share her work with you guys today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Katie and Margaret, for inviting me and for you all to tune in. I know we're all feeling a little bit zoomed out at this stage of the pandemic. And as Katie said, I'm an ecologist who really works at the interface of ecology and economics. And in particular, I study how ecosystems contribute to human well-being and how humans affect nature both through impacting ecosystems, but also through management actions that can conserve biodiversity and natural systems. And I don't need to convince this group at the sink of this, but people are really central to this research area. This map, for example, shows just how connected the planet is and how human dominated the planet is, where the bright colors are showing the travel distance to a nearest urban center, and the blue lines are showing transportation networks across the planet. So people are not only causing problems, but they also dictate how we manage and value, or we dictate how we manage and value ecosystems. So a central question of my talk and of my research group is, how can we maintain ecosystem services in the face of global change? And when I'm going to talk about ecosystem services, I'm talking about the broad suite of contributions that nature provides to humans. And these can be things like timber or food with direct market value, but also functions that, pollination of crops or shoreline protection from coastal ecosystems that depend on different ecosystem processes, all the way to the intrinsic value of biodiversity or the cultural appreciation of nature. And ecosystem services, or nature's contribution to human well-being, have become key goals for ecosystem management and policy. And ecosystem services are a key management goal, but this goal is challenged by global change because humans are driving various changes across the planet that are altering ecosystems and can feed back and have consequences for human well-being. And these are types of changes like land use change, climate change, invasions, and overharvesting of species. So when I talk about global change, I'm going to be talking about drivers like these. And in particular, today, I'm going to focus on some of my work thinking about extreme disturbance events. So given this backdrop of global change and my motivating question of how to best maintain ecosystem services, I'm going to present two research questions that's an example of my work, which is at the interface of ecology, economics, and management. And both projects are actually parts of interdisciplinary teams to tackle these really complicated challenges that require drawing on expertise and tools from multiple perspectives. So the first question I'm going to address is, how do disturbances impact ecosystem services? And on one hand, there's a vast amount of studies and research that focus on how disturbances and global change impact populations and ecosystems and communities from ecology. But a lot of those studies don't always go all the way to measuring responses of services or thinking about how people value nature in terms of services. So that is potentially this whole body of work that could potentially inform this question and help us understand how services are going to change, but that premise is largely untested. And on the other hand, most assessments of ecosystem services currently ignore disturbances and focus on average conditions. So I'm going to first talk about a study that's trying to advance that link in our understanding. Then the second part of the talk is going to focus on this question of how management can best moderate impacts to services. And I'm really excited to share this part of the talk because it's going to show you some ongoing work through Succinct, where we're thinking about the role that conservation and management decisions play in mediating the effects of global change through human decisions. So for example, management is responding to changes in ecosystems and services when invasive species come in and create impacts to those services, and how we best decide to allocate our conservation resources can ultimately feed back and affect the impacts of global change through these human decisions. So first, I'll start off with the question of how disturbances are impacting ecosystem services. And a motivation for me for studying the impacts of disturbances in the context of global change is that climate change is not only altering mean conditions, but making disturbances more extreme and more frequent. Examples of this are the mega fires that we've been seeing here in Colorado and in California, and also major drought events, just as examples. So climate change is also making disturbances that are more intense, more frequent compared to historical disturbance regimes. So we're seeing a shift where these more intense events are becoming more probable. And this is leading to impacts already in ecosystems, even like the boreal forest or deserts and systems that are adapted to disturbance, because we're really pushing these ecosystems outside of their historical norms. And this is the challenge for anticipating the consequences, because we also have uncertainty over disturbance events. So this project is really focused on asking this question of how can we anticipate the impacts of disturbances to ecosystems and their services? And I'm going to break this down in two questions. What are the consequences of these shifting and uncertain disturbance regimes for ecosystems and services? And then the second question is really coming back to this idea or premise that we could use ecological studies to inform potential threats to ecosystem services. So we're also asking, do measures that are commonly used to describe ecological responses to disturbance also predict changes in ecosystem services? And this is an exciting collaboration with economists, mathematicians, and ecosystem and community ecologists. So hopefully within the spirit of Succinct. So a key contribution of our work that we are focusing on here is also that this idea that disturbances and disturbance regimes are changing, but we don't know which are going to occur when and where. And to provide some background on why we think this is a contribution, I'll just review briefly how this builds on existing work in ecology. So most ecological studies on disturbances involve some retrospective empirical analysis after a disturbance event occurs, or we often do a lot of experiments where we might manipulate temperature or nitrogen addition or use process-based models. But in a lot of cases, those treat disturbances as deterministic or look at if a particular disturbance event will happen for sure. Then broadening this to the ecosystem services literature, most ecosystem service studies to date often map ecosystem services under average conditions, ignoring disturbance. So this gives a great idea of where and in what quantity services are on a landscape, but it could potentially miss important things like events happening within a year, like disturbances that could really change the quantity, quality, or spatial distribution of services. So in contrast, our project models a potential set of future disturbances where we might not know the intensity of the disturbance that's going to occur, but we know with some probability that might be changing. So this leads us to be able to examine a distribution of potential futures under changing disturbance regimes. So what we do is create a new mathematical framework that aims to link disturbances to people. And the ideas here are that we have some disturbance regime that might be shifting with climate change. So here you can see the more extreme disturbances are becoming more probable. Then a disturbance occurs with some probability and has an impact to the ecological community. We can then generate, using information on species functional traits or characteristics, the response of that community to a given disturbance, the implications for how that changes ecosystem services using typical ecosystem service production function approaches. But in this case, that actually take the ecological community as an input to that production, and then map that to benefits to people, which of course depend on people's preferences for services, values, whether they're market or other sources of values, and policy change. So a key part of this framework is that we're using species functional traits to understand responses to disturbances of communities and also the effects of those communities on ecosystem services. And we think this is important because species traits can predict responses to environmental change, but also show how species have different effects on ecosystem functions or services. And this will really dictate the response of an ecosystem and ecosystem services to disturbances across a landscape. And you can see this really simply in this picture after a big blowdown event, where you can see that certain trees are still standing, others have blown down and have died, and there are different responses of different species. And this is also going to have different effects on different functions like above ground biomass or carbon storage. So we actually use this example of an extreme wind event to test and parameterize our framework. And in particular, we focus on severe windstorms in northern Minnesota, representative boreal forests, across these counties here in over 770 different forest inventory plots. And so what we have in each plot is a community of trees, and we know information about the sizes and the distribution of sizes of those trees. So we focus here on size as a key trait because we know that size is a good predictor of mortality of a tree species for a particular wind event. And they also can help us understand potential contributions to ecosystem services like timber, also above ground biomass and carbon. So the way that the framework plays out is for each community and for a given disturbance, we can take the initial community and then we can generate a new community based on known and empirically estimated trait mortality relationships. So as I mentioned before, there's known relationships between the size of a tree on the x-axis and its probability of mortality, which depends on which species and also what type or like the strength of intensity of the disturbance. So using Monte Carlo simulations, we can then generate a new expected community from that information. And we also have known relationships between the sizes of these trees and their biomass or volume in terms of different timber products. And so we can then also generate, based on these empirically known relationships, expected service levels following a particular disturbance. And so the approach goes all the way from a beginning community to the end expected service value for each potential disturbance intensity. And this is just one run. But in reality, we do this entire sequence over 10,000 times using Monte Carlo simulations. And each iteration of those simulations give us one potential realization of the future that could arise for this community under disturbances. So to show you what I mean by this, here's that little sequence that I showed you, but we really do this over and over and over again, each time sampling a distribution of, or sampling a disturbance with a given probability of occurring, And this generates an outcome of potential future communities and potential service levels. So with this output, we can do a lot of things with it. We can calculate various aspects of change, of different service levels, and we can also see how those outputs differ if we vary this probability distribution. So for example, we can shift to have the more extreme disturbances be more probable under climate change, or look at past or current regimes of disturbances. So for an example, we can measure, and we measure community similarities. So we can compare the before and after communities across a particular disturbance regime. And so this is one commonly used metric in ecology to look at community change. We also compute another common metric, which is community stability, or the coefficient of variation of the biomass of a community under a particular disturbance regime. And then we can actually compare that to what the outcomes are, or would be expected to be for the ecosystem services. So we also quantify 3 different outcomes for services: the expected value or amount, the variance in that value across the potential realizations of disturbances, and the expected fraction of services remaining on average for a given regime. So I'll show you our results. First, again, we are going to be plotting this fraction of service remaining for a given disturbance regime. And I'll just show you right now the current disturbance regime. And then all of the points here that are going to show up are the outcomes for each of the forest plots in our study region. And the key takeaway as well is a comparison to this line here, which is no disturbance, or as current ecosystem service assessments would often do, if we ignore disturbance, we might anticipate the service levels to be here. So we can compare what our approach compared to the status quo would tell us. So what we find is that ignoring disturbances can actually miss a lot of loss in services that could occur. There's a lot going on here, but the first thing to notice is that this gray line here is under 1. And so we see a wedge between what the status quo assessments would predict for service change and what our approach would predict. And this wedge could be even larger with climate change, we find, when more intense disturbances become more probable. So that's the first result in comparison to current ecosystem service assessments. We also look at how this compares to if we looked at an ecological measure of change. So these deviations from this gray line show how different the ecosystem service value prediction is compared to if we only looked at biomass. So below the line means that the ecosystem service value is worse off than the biomass or volume. And above the line indicates that the ecosystem service value is better off than the biomass or volume. And you can see here that there's actually a lot of variation across plots. And we find, looking at this in more depth, that that difference or variation is really driven by species traits. So driven by differences in species responses and effects that can help us understand these potential changes. So here we see a lot of deviation from this common metric of an ecosystem service metric to community similarity. We also compare how community change predicts ecosystem service change if we're looking at the community stability in terms of the coefficient of variation. So looking at the community stability, or the coefficient of variation, compared to the expected value of the service on the y-axis, or the variance in the value, we see under various scenarios that there's very little correspondence, and that the community change is not a good predictor of these estimates of services. And this is actually pretty surprising in our case study, given that timber value is so reliant on biomass and volume of the trees. But of course, there's differences in the value of the species and the relative contribution of different species to various products. So in conclusion from the first part of this talk, we find and develop an approach to look at the potential for disturbances to have impacts on ecosystem services. And we find that these impacts can be quite large and that also they vary with the species trait composition. And also that ecological metrics of community change, at least in our case study, are not good predictors of ecosystem service change. And a next step for this is to test this framework in other systems and also to think about extending these ideas. A PhD student of mine, Aislinn Keys, is working on these types of questions in the context of ecological food webs and species losses. Great. So if we can anticipate how species and ecosystem services are going to respond to global change, a next clear question is, what can we do about it? Since management clearly moderates the impacts to ecosystem services. And this is a really hard challenge and one that I imagine a lot of groups at SYNC are thinking about, because resource management is often constrained by low budgets, high complexity in social ecological systems, and limited information or resources to gather more information. So in the remaining time, I'll walk through one example of this problem and a solution that we're working on through a SYNC group that I'm co-leading with Kaylin Croats, where we're drawing on solutions from network science and complex systems to help us provide shortcuts or heuristics for managing these complex social ecological systems. And I'm going to, in particular, talk about an example of invasive species management, which is really characteristic of a lot of these challenges that we face in resource management in complex social ecological systems. And invasive species are one of the top drivers of biodiversity loss following land use change and overexploitation, and they cost billions of dollars in management and damages each year and threaten a lot of native ecosystems and ecosystem services, and they're only increasing in their prevalence. I'm going to focus on a particular invasive species management question that used to be in my backyard for managing the widespread zebra mussel invasion in the Midwest, and in particular in Minnesota. And the zebra mussel is rapidly expanding and spreading in its range, associated primarily with overland spread of recreational boaters. So you can see here the red dots are infected lakes and the blue are uninfected, and the blue lines are actually movement of boaters between lakes. So boater movement, where the boats actually have typically the larval stages of the mussel, where boats then move between lakes, is one of the primary drivers of spread in these systems. And once the zebra mussels can establish, they can have really dramatic impacts on ecosystems. They can have major impacts to infrastructure, recreational value, and they could also re-engineer ecosystems, extirpate native mussel species, and have also been shown to affect property value. But once they're established, they're really, really hard, if not impossible, to eradicate. So right now in our management context in Minnesota, the primary management tool and objective is to slow the spread of this species to prevent further damages. So we're tackling this complex problem that really requires this interdisciplinary collaboration. So we've brought together a team of computational biologists, economists, experts in aquatic invasive species, operation research, and also network science. And together we're tackling this question of how to best manage this invasion with limited resources. And Specifically, given the lack of options for eradication, we're considering the goal of preventing further spread. And the primary way to do that is by establishing inspection stations where someone from the county will come and inspect the watercrafts and issue a fine if people do have the zebra mussel there. But there's really a limited budget. Still, it's pretty big, $10 million a year for the counties, but they must decide across over 10,000 lakes in the state where to actually allocate these inspection stations to achieve this goal of preventing further spread. So it's a pretty complicated problem, particularly if you remember that graphic that I showed you with all of the high connectivity in the system. And here we're going to actually test the potential for approaches that draw on network science and epidemiology to help us inform how to manage this invasion with limited resources. And in particular, we ask two questions. To what extent can network structure be used to guide management? And how does performance of network guided management depend on information about network structure? Since a key constraint in these systems in many places is low information. And I just want to give a shout out to the lead author on this work, Dr. Jamie Ashander, who's a postdoc fellow with Resources of the Future for the Future, which is a key founder and collaborator with SYSYNC. So in order to test these questions, we develop an approach that has 4 steps that I'll walk through now. The first is to construct network data. And in our case, it's on human boater movement, which really is a good description of spread or potential spread. So the nodes in this network are the lakes, and the edges between, you can see in the blue, are directed movement of boaters between the lakes. So the first step is to identify the structure of this network. And we do this in collaboration with Dr. Nick Phelps and Bob Haight with the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Center, where they have surveyed data on boaters and boater movement between lakes. So again, really leveraging this as a collaborative opportunity. The second part of our approach is to compute the optimal intervention strategy using linear integer programming per county for different budgets. And we do this by finding the optimal places to allocate these inspection stations in each county, given a limited budget, with the goal to maximize the number of infected boats that are inspected, given that humans are moving between these connected lakes. The next step is to then identify, using network approaches, these common metrics that describe network centrality, including degree, betweenness, centrality, and other metrics. And then we rank the locations based on these metrics and place inspection stations until the budget runs out. We can then evaluate the performance of these management strategies. And in this context, performance means how many potentially infective boats have we inspected under the strategy. And as another benchmark, we also compare the network guided strategy to one where we would just randomly place the inspection stations with no information about the connectivity of the system. Then finally, the last aspect of the framework is to evaluate how these metrics using network approaches depend on or perform depending on different levels of information. And information is a key constraint for effective management and adds to the challenge of managing these complex systems. So we think that the network approaches might be particularly promising under scenarios of low information where our typical tools for optimization are not tractable. So we do this under different information scenarios. The first is actually that our system has quite a bit of information. So we're actually in an extreme case with a lot of rich data. And we know the distribution of infected versus uninfected lakes, as well as weighted directed movement between the lakes. So we can also strip away that information and compare it to a scenario with really more minimal information, where we only have the topology, where we know where the lakes are and that there's some connection between them, but that's it. And there's also cases in between that I'm not going to have time to talk about today. So we look at this case of full information with the directed weighted links and infection status of the lakes. We can also compare it to this low information, and we can look at how the metrics perform compared to random. And again, one potential advantage, if this performs well, is that informing management with network metrics doesn't require the full amount of optimization, full amount of information that the optimization approach would. Like in this case, it would require the full. So under the full information scenario, we compare the performance of the metrics compared to the optimal and compared to a random scenario where we just randomly allocate the inspection stations. And what we find is that the simple network and metrics can achieve 99.8% of optimal performance with the full information. So pretty darn close to optimal. Then we look at these situations that are potentially more interesting for us from the network science perspective of testing the promise of these tools. And we find under the low information scenario that the network metrics still do pretty darn good. They achieve over 82% of the optimum, and they do substantially better than random. And just to remind you, this is the situation with limited information where we couldn't really apply this optimization approach. So we're pretty excited about this result. And it also holds when we consider different budgets. So in conclusion from this part of the talk, we find that network structure can provide heuristics that get you pretty darn close to optimal control for biological invasions, with potentially less information required than our common toolkit in bioeconomics. And one thing that we also demonstrated that I don't really have time to talk about today is we are also seeing promise that these techniques could scale up to these more complicated, larger systems, because we can look at all of these different counties and there's different numbers of lakes in the county. And we're finding that counties with larger systems, so more lakes and more connections, in those systems, the network approaches are actually performing better than in these smaller systems. So these are exactly the types of contexts where we really need new tools to deal with complexity of management. So given this Zoom virtual format, I'd also like to say, if this wasn't your cup of tea, there's many other topics that our group is working on, and I, as well as other folks in my lab, would be excited to connect about these topics, ranging from social ecological networks for ecosystem services to adaptive management to climate impacts on fisheries and landscape planning in Boulder, Colorado. So in summary, I'd like to thank our funders, particularly Succinct, and also my collaborators, and particularly Dr. Jamie Ashander, who is the lead author on the last paper that I presented. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Laura. We have some questions in the chat. Our first question in the Q&A is from Chris, and he asks, in your simulations, how long is the duration of the simulation? How many years or time steps? And is it after a single event, or is there potential for multiple disturbances over time?
Yes, that's a great question. So it's entirely an event-based model. So it's just a before after with no dynamics. So part of that was an active decision to do this, where we wanted to really focus on being able to do a lot of disturbance intensities and focus on that uncertainty aspect, because there's other great landscape disturbance models like Landis that really dig into a lot of the dynamics, but don't typically quantify ecosystem services or responses of different groups of species. So there should be potential for doing multiple disturbances within this framework, but right now we haven't done dynamics. But if that's something you'd like to talk about, please reach out, because I think a next step of what we are thinking about was to also add fire, which has pretty much the opposite relationship with tree size that wind does. So we think it would be pretty interesting to look at through this lens.
Awesome. Another question relating to the forest case study was wondering if you could speak to how spatial variables might affect your results. So how would areas that are more prone to things like soil erosion differ from areas that are relatively more stable?
Yeah, let me see if I could bring this up. Can you see this?
Yep.
Right. So I didn't show these maps because they're showing average outcomes at a county level, which I think masks a lot of the variation, but we're still playing around with different ways of visualizing the results. So there's absolutely a lot of spatial variation. And in this example, because it's not really, there aren't great forecasts for these extreme wind events for how they're going to vary spatially in the future. We just applied the same disturbances across the landscape. So what's really interesting about this is you can see a lot of variation in the colors, and that's entirely driven by differences in the before communities. So yes, a lot of variation, and probably even more variation if we considered the spatial distributions of disturbance intensity as well. And just to point out, a lot of the variation is masked in these figures, so that's why I didn't show them. But if you have ideas for how I could show it, please reach out.
Okay, we have another question from Alexa. Do you think that disturbance incidence or severity is the greatest source of uncertainty in forecasting how extreme events may affect ecosystem services in the future? And are there other important sources of uncertainty in the mechanistic model you used?
Yeah, so that's really the one that we focused on. But let's see if I can show some other results. I didn't really show this, but another thing that we considered that you can't, there's another way of showing it, I don't think I have, but we also considered a scenario not only of climate change, but of how humans would respond. So if humans would actually, for instance, if you had a loss of timber value, depending on the markets and how connected they are, like would demand, or like would the prices increase or would they decrease? And actually that's, I think, another important uncertainty is like how people are going to be managing or valuing services in the future, because that almost offset some of the impacts from climate change. So I think these coupling these scenarios with changes in kind of human preferences, values, society, management with the climate ones, I think would be really important, because how people adapt is it going to be another big source of uncertainty, and it's going to change the outcomes a lot. But I would say a lot of that is missed in ecological studies that would stop at ecosystem impacts.
There's another question in, we have some more coming in through the Q&A. So in the FR versus forest plot graph, how is fraction of service defined? Any comment on the variance seen on the plot?
Yeah, so what we do, it's actually maybe easier to see here. This is a new measure that we made up. And we're calling it functional resistance, where we basically will compute the pre-disturbance service value of a community and the post-disturbance service value, and then can look at the change as a measure of resistance. So how much or how little did the service value change for a particular disturbance or disturbance regime? And the variance in that plot is going to depend on which species are in the community, how they respond to the disturbance and what their sizes are, and also the intensity, because I didn't show this, but actually there's different mortality curves for different intensities. So those things together are what's driving the variation. And also in terms of the service value, the other thing driving variation is differences in the timber markets across counties, because I didn't mention this, but to go from the amount of the service to the value, I forgot to say we also use timber market data for different types of products and which products are harvested and how much their value depends on the county. So that's driving some differences as well.
Very cool. Bill had a question about the data as well. Are your data ground collected, or is there any use of remote sensing data? And if so, what resolutions?
A lot of this, yeah, this is using the forest inventory data. So the initial communities and the scaling to biomass volume are based on forest inventory methods. And then the disturbance response are based on empirical studies that have happened after different wind intensities. And then going to this is also using the timber market data. So no remote sensing data, but that would be something interesting to do, because really you could be parameterizing any of these with whatever data, or even the disturbance responses with, mathematical models or, first principles.
Okay, that's all of the questions we have so far. I don't know if anyone wants to pop any more questions into the Q&A. Couldn't find any in the chat. So, oh, we have another one. Do you look at one trait and service with each iteration of your model, or do you consider multiple traits and multiple ecosystem services at the same time?
Yeah, so the primary trait here is size, just given these known relationships, but there's actually some other traits like height that are embedded in this one that I didn't really talk about. And we can produce multiple service values. Right now, what we're doing that, let me see if I have a plot, is comparing some different outcomes for a single service. So looking at trade-offs in things like the variance versus the levels of the services. So you could do this with multiple services pretty easily. If you have these relationships, you could then compute a second service and then look at trade-offs in those outcomes. Right now, we've done it for the single one, just given, the first step with this, but that's definitely the next step.
Another question, in relation to soil erosion, are you aware of anyone applying similar methods or how to connect them?
Right now, I think that some of the stuff that goes all the way from the disturbances to including the community structure in the production functions is a new frontier. I think that probably the closest to this particular work is some of the work on disturbances and ecosystem responses using Landis and these big landscape dynamic simulations. So I think one thing that would be interesting is extending those to think about ecosystem services, and then comparing under what scenarios you could use a simpler approach like this. And I'm sure there's probably other people that are trying to incorporate community structure and ecosystem service production models. I don't know right off the top of my head, but I do think it requires an interdisciplinary effort.
In relation to the muscle work, we have a question. Do you have any thoughts about the unknown unknowns of a network, i.e., what if there are other nodes or lakes that don't have Boulder connectivity data?
Yeah, so we know, I mean, I think the lakes are not the limitation because we know where the lakes are, but the Boulder connectivity is estimated using gravity models. So there is some uncertainty in the actual connectivity. But I think what this approach would potentially like be missing there is the weight of the links, not necessarily the presence or absence, just given how this was sampled. This is speculation, but we show that the metrics still perform pretty well, even if you have no information on the direction or weight of the links. I think we could look at this basically then kind of adding more observation error into the links and test that. And that would be a cool idea to do for sure.
Rachel asked, how did you share the network analysis results for the zebra mussel invasions with managers? And is there a data visualization tool for managers to use this type of modeling with their own communities?
Yeah, so we're fortunate to be working really closely with Nick Phelps, who's the director of the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Center, and Bob Haight, who works with the Forest Service. And they're working directly with county managers who came to them to try to help develop these optimization models for allocating the inspection stations. So that provides a direct route for this work with managers. And they also have this website, I think it's called AISexplorer.org, where they've put all the data layers for managers to explore and maps of infection status. And we hope to be eventually getting this information in that web interface where they have workshops with managers. And so that's really, Bob and Nick are leading that engagement.
We have another question. How can you correlate back to the forest case study? How can you correlate it with climate change when your system is not an undisturbed area?
Can you clarify that question?
I'm not sure. Yavid, could you elaborate on your question? Someone else asked in the chat in the meantime, if you could mention that website.
Yeah, I'd have to, I think it's AISexplorer.org, but I'd have to check the exact thing. But if you look up the MACERC, Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Center, yeah, I think it's linked on their website.
Actually, I want to know, means you have correlated, you are saying that the impact should be from the climate change, and I want to know how many, when your system is, for example, the forest ecosystem is undisturbed, means it is disturbed. So how can you correlate with the climate change? This factor can be from some other thing, means to the disturbance, grazing, or something else. So how you can correlate with the climate change, that this impact is from the climate change?
So basically, yes, there is disturbances in the communities prior. And so we basically will get a snapshot of that community. And then we're thinking about future scenarios. So it's not really about what happened or not and parsing out the role of climate change in that. And then, like I said, we're making assumptions about what those distributions could look like. And that could be based on real data. So like, what was the probability of occurrence, based on the historical record or data, or it could be done using forecasts. It just so happens for this type of, to my knowledge, this type of event, these windstorms that are inland, there aren't really good forecasts of spatially how they're going to change. So we just treated it as, a lot of uncertainty, but shifts towards the more extreme events that have been observed based on what we read.
We have one more question in the chat and Q&A. Bill asked, what specifically do you mean by climate change? What are the variables?
Yeah, so in this case, climate change is just purely represented as a shift towards the more intense events becoming more probable. So changing that distribution. You could represent climate change in other ways in this more general framework. So like separating the general framework from our application, where you might have forecasts of future communities that you would then want to apply this to, or maybe changes in the ways that the species are responding, or even changes in how the disturbances in the future or climate change is going to affect the mapping between a species and a service. So those are definitely things that we've talked about. It was just, it's possible within this framework, just we didn't do in the example. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Laura, for
I just put my email in the chat. If anyone has any other follow-up questions, I would be happy to hear from people. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for a great talk, and thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to take a break for a few weeks, but our next Sync seminar will be March 23rd with Dr. Katie Peterson and Dr. Ryan Ux. So I hope you'll join us then.